transnational perspective, and it's work that has earned him an impressive list of fellowships and awards, including most recently the W.L. Mackenzie King Fellowship at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. His book manuscript, Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of Pan-African North America, 1919 to 92, which is based on his PhD research, is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. I think it's also worth mentioning that Wendell is what I would call a model of an active public historian, and a Google search of his name will bring you to a considerable list of his authored articles and also media interviews, whether in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, or other outlets that place contemporary issues of race, of justice, and of pluralism in conversation with the past. And that's one of the things that, as historians, we can really bring to such public conversations. Welcome, Wendell, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for such a generous introduction. By show of raised thumbs, can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. At any point, if you hear some static from my end, it's likely because of my very grisly beard getting in the way of my earpiece. So kindly just advise and I will modify. Okay, let me enable screen share. Okay. So my talk, my brief talk this evening is entitled Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, Black Migration in the Great Lakes Basin, 1920s to 1940s. Like to get a couple of housekeeping matters out of the way. Again, Daniel, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for your correspondence and staying on top of our exchanges, although sometimes I am terrified to look in my inbox, and I'm not going to disclose how many unanswered emails I have. I really do admire your professionalism and your patience in that regard. Bonsoir tous et toutes. My name is Wendell Nii Laryea Adjetey, and again, kudos, Daniel, for perfectly pronouncing my name. It's always a joy when that happens. Special thanks to Sean McCutcheon and Erica Harris as well for their assistance in facilitating my talk today. Thank you all for attending. I'm sure there's much that you could be doing and probably need to be doing on this winter day. And lastly, I'd like to give a special shout out or thanks to our late colleague, Jeudi, who invariably had something to do with my invitation. Thank you, Jared, for being such a kind man and colleague. There are three central questions that animate my broader research agenda. In the interest of time, however, I'm only going to highlight one. How did the Americas become a cosmopolitan, Pan-African hemispheric zone as a result of shared racial experiences, transnationalism, migration, Black spirituality, Black power, Black nationalism, as well as US and Canadian imperialism? A quick note on definition. So you'll likely hear me invoke two forms of Pan-Africanism. There's a Pan-Africanism with a P, which is sort of a formally recognized movement for African and Black self-determination. And then there's a lower P Pan-Africanism, which is generally speaking sort of a grassroots racial solidarity. It's what a Barbadian immigrant who came to the United States and Canada in the 1910s called Brothers of the Skin, right? So it's this sort of racial affinity. Quick note, actually, in the vein of Pan-Africanism, sort of capital P Pan-Africanism, you've likely heard of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the most audacious manifestation of this political movement, the history of the Atlantic world. There's the Pan-African Congresses, over which W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida Gibbs Hunt presided in the early to mid 20th century. There's certainly the Organization of African Unity, which Kwame Nkrumah was instrumental. The first president of Ghana was instrumental in spearheading, and also the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which Malcolm X founded, with similar aims of Pan-African liberation in the Black world. A quick note on terminology. So I'll likely invoke diasporic Africans, African North Americans, Black, African American, African Canadian. And these are appellations that I use to distinguish a group of peoples who have a particularly unique history, but a unique history that comes out of chattel enslavement in the Americas. So there's that shared history, and individuals who, notwithstanding this history of enslavement and racial subordination and subjugation, nonetheless asserted their right to reap the bounties of these diasporic lands, right? Be it Turtle Island, be it the Caribbean Basin, etc. Majority of their enslaved ancestors' uncompensated labor. And so when you hear me referring to diasporic Africans, African North Americans, Black, African American, African Canadian, I'm speaking to a group of Black folk in the Americas with a shared history. And lastly, my presentation will first provide sort of an analytical historiographical overview, and then I will follow that briefly with a couple of biographical vignettes. Natal alienation was the push factor that compelled diasporic Africans to look beyond the artificial and porous borders of colony, empire, or nation state. Cross-border consciousness increased one's sense of freedom. Because the pursuit of transnational belonging stemmed from alienation and racial indignity, those who embraced Pan-Africanisms in North America resisted in subtle ways the hegemony of the sovereign state to confine Black agency. As partly borderlands, partly colonized peoples, citizenship, that is, national identity, allegiance to a sovereign entity, and notions of belonging and enfranchisement seemed elusive. Cross-border migration, or what I call self-exile, mitigated to some extent the potency of anti-Black racism. Grassroots Pan-Africanism and transnationalism became a process through which diasporic Africans forged an imagined community. And in the words of historian Robin Kelly, tried to create a different sort of nation-building project. Exploring the dislocation, relocation, resettlement, and rootedness of diasporic Africans illuminates the social history of how Black workers and activists imagined a Pan-African zone in the Great Lakes Basin during the 1930s and 1940s. As diasporic peoples whose allegiance to a specific place depended on the ebb and flow of race relations and other socioeconomic and political forces at a given moment, Blackness functioned as a bridging mechanism that connected borderlands peoples with a shared history and identity. From the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, a group of highly mobile African North Americans who practiced a localized version of Pan-Africanism, sometimes a bourgeois Du Boisian version or a militant Black nationalist Garveyite version, lived, worked, nurtured families, and agitated for full citizenship in the United States and Canada at different moments of their lives. They forged a cross border continental identity as agents whose citizenship transcended both countries, often including the British West Indies. For all North Americans, this fluid frontier functioned as the source of rich cross pollination. Historians have described the Great Lakes region as a permeable border and a zone of cultural mixing and interchange. Others note that Canadian US cross border migration symbolized a great natural phenomena, perceiving the children of Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario as, quote, eminently capable of allegiance to one country one day and to another the next, end quote. This interconnectedness influenced the ways that African descendants experienced life in the Great Lakes cities. For those who practiced interspatial citizenship, that is, racial belonging in the liminal space along an international border, cross border movement remained a persistent feature of continental life. Serial border crossers who engaged in repeat migration underscored the extent to which mobility and social and labor market integration in Canada and the United States influenced their life trajectory. Moreover, the phenomenon of racial passing, i.e., transitioning from one racial group to another to escape social, economic, and political discrimination against a specific group, is a construct that frames border crossing as a form of citizenship passing. This process allowed Canadians of African descent to pass as African Americans and African Americans to pass as African Canadians. Caribbean immigrants, with their heightened consciousness as British subjects and awareness of class and color caste, passed as Canadian nationals or US citizens or both. Similarly to racial passing, citizenship passing entailed a chosen exile, in the words of Allison Hobbs. Because passing was a voluntary act of movement and migration, unlike deportation or extradition, it necessitated transitioning from one sovereign soil to another. In the process, migrants exchanged one identity for another, sometimes discarding a former identity, but always melding aspects of belonging to personal advantage. Just as a point of reference, I wanted to give you a sense of the Great Lakes region and Great Lakes cities, and in particular, the two principal nodes of exchange or points of entry, if I may, um, is in the Detroit Windsor corridor, and also the um, sort of Buffalo Toronto corridor, just east of Lake Erie, south of Lake Ontario, southwest of Lake Ontario. Historians have amply documented the south, north, and southwest axes of the Great Migration. However, an equally important facet worth excavating is the north-south migration of African descendants into US cities, such as Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, and Chicago in the 1930s and 1940s. During its economic boom after the Great War, the United States, having curtailed its reliance on European labor, resembled, quote, a suction pump on Canada's urban and industrial areas. Some Canadians described this general phenomenon between 1921 and the eve of the Great Depression, 1929, as the Great Emigration with an E. For the Dominion, in other words, quote, Europeans came in and Canadians moved out, end quote. In the 1920s, approximately 1.2 million Canadian-born persons resided in the United States, or about 8% of Canada's population. Bidirectional border crossings persisted well into the interwar period. This permeable border threatened the survival of Canada's small Black population. In 1905, Dr. Anderson Ruffin Abbott, the first African Canadian trained physician and one of 8 Black surgeons who served in the US Civil War, wrote, and I quote, "Our youth evince a strong disposition to cross the borderline as soon as they acquire sufficient knowledge and experience to make a living. In this way, we, as in Canadian society, are impoverished, and you, US society, are correspondingly benefited." Abbott, who had been friends with President Abraham Lincoln and his wife Amy Todd, predicted, quote, "By the process of absorption and expatriation, the color line will eventually fade out in Canada," end quote. As an integrationist, Abbott foresaw a society with little to no trace of a distinct Black presence. The Dominion's resistance to Black immigration in the early 1900s made Dr. Abbott's prediction conceivable. Because the methodology for racial classification and the collection of immigration statistics varied from one census to another in Canada and the United States in the early 20th century, inconsistencies and gaps emerged to thwart the historian. An open border in the early 1900s meant that an undeterminable number of migrants simply crossed from one country to the other without coming to the attention of immigration officials. Anti-Black sentiments, however, and I might qualify that, virulent anti-Black sentiments, meant that border officials scrutinized Black cross-border migrants. Furthermore, Canadian census takers consistently underestimated the Black population. Changing and differing notions of racial categories or place of origin, coupled with the itinerant nature of sleeping car porters, many of whom were Black men, complicated the enumeration of the Black population, handicapping the Dominion's ability to maintain accurate statistics. The 1950 US Census and Canadian immigration records provide a snapshot of the quote unquote alien or foreign born population in Great Lakes cities in the 1940s. Because Canada and the United States disclosed census data fully after 92 and 72 years, respectively, the 1950 US population statistics from Great Lakes states are the newest and most reliable for the 1940s. These US population statistics differentiated between Francophone and Anglophone Canadians residing in the United States. The overwhelming majority of Canadian-born Black folk self-identified as English-speaking, which meant that enumerators likely listed almost all Canadian-born Black people under Canada Other instead of Canada French, a category that in all actuality included some diasporic Africans born in the French Caribbean, like Guadeloupe, Martinique, the former Saint-Domingue, Haiti. Furthermore, some French Canadians, Quebecois, like African North Americans, engaged in repeat migration. Unlike Black migrants, however, French Canadians in New England and Great Lakes states had a welcoming home to which officials in Quebec sincerely hoped some would return and nation build. And pardon me for my, I guess, derelict French or my atrophied French. It's been about, I lived in Montreal when I was in second grade, and I'm still astonished at how quickly my siblings and I learned French, but bad Ontario. We lost a lot of it in Ontario. But in 1895, as a response to the French-Canadian exodus, French-Canadian authorities founded the Société Générale de Colonisation et de Rapatriement de la Province de Quebec to stop further emigration from the province to the United States and to encourage immigrants to return and nation build. As a young country that underwent rapid nation building at the turn of the 20th century, Canada proved a popular destination for US immigrants. Between 1901 and 1931, 2 million US immigrants entered Canada. By 1933, however, a little over 344,000 appeared in the census, underscoring a trend of return migration to the United States. Quote, if we count all of Canadian stock, and this was written by the chief statistician in 1937, perhaps a third of us are south of the line, whilst certainly not more than 1% of the Americans are north, end quote. As a snapshot in time, decade by decade, census data can reveal only so much. By creating a collage of Pan-African microbiographies, the historian can capture to some degree the rich fluidity that characterized life in the US-Canadian borderlands. Canadians have a long record of seeking employment and maintaining family ties in Great Lakes states and throughout New England. As the most strategic and adjacent border city, Detroit attracted Canadians in droves. In 1930, nearly 95,000 Canadian-born persons resided in the city of Detroit alone, which was over 6% of its population. In Michigan, in the entire state, about 1,500 Canadian-born Black people lived in the state, most of whom resided or worked in Wayne County, which is sort of the municipal seat of Detroit, compared to 376 who resided in Illinois, 459 in Ohio, 866 in the state of New York, and over 1,400 in Massachusetts. The largest sum of African Canadians in Massachusetts is attributable to Black folk who had lived in Canadian society for many, many generations, going back to the 18th century, or those whose parents had immigrated to Canada from the Anglophone Caribbean in the early 1900s to work in the coal mines and coke ovens in the Maritimes. Some of their descendants traveled west to Quebec and Ontario, but others traveled south to New England, New York State, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and other destinations. The 1930 US Census enumerated only 5,800 Canadian-born Black persons, or 0.45% of the total Canadian-born population of nearly 1.3 million in the country. Now, it's worth noting that in the early 1900s, even though there were some serious hiccups with how the Dominion statistician enumerated the Black population, and some individuals invariably probably passed as white, or because they listed their status or identity as British subjects coming from the Anglophone Caribbean, it was difficult to capture just how many Black people were in Canada. But around this time, it sort of ebbed and flowed, around 20,000 people. So that's a tiny drop in the bucket, principally because Canada's immigration laws were quite hostile to Black immigrants. Their small numbers notwithstanding, Canadian-born Black folk, or those with meaningful connections to Canada, had an outsized influence on race relations in the United States by 1940. That year, 90% of the Canadian-born Black population lived in urban areas, the highest urban concentration among their compatriots in the United States. All Canadian expatriates fell under three categories: those who were naturalized, those who had first papers, i.e., they had begun the process of naturalization or permanent residency, and those who were deemed as quote unquote alien. Using biographical vignettes of cross-border archetypes, my presentation will highlight North American Pan-Africanism as a form of interspatial citizenship and the nexus of Great Lakes cities and states during the 1930s and 1940s. Cross-border migration allowed African descendants in North America whose subordinate citizenship differentiated them from white people, including recently arrived European immigrants, to pursue work, leisure, family reunification, military service, or civil rights, i.e., uplift. Rather than fracture racial identity over geographical space, race or blackness and mobility facilitated community building and solidarity on the North American mainland. On your screen is Beulah Cousins, who was born in Chatham, Ontario in 1907. You could likely tell that she is of part European ancestry. Her mother was white and her father was African Canadian, whose ancestors had sought refuge in southwestern Ontario during the antebellum period. Cousins attended the local African Methodist Episcopal Church in her hometown of Chatham, Essex County, which proved to be a natural magnet for US bishops, elders, ministers, many of whom came from Detroit, from Cleveland, and as far away as Kansas City. These fellow AME congregants allowed Cousins, in her own words, to hear from the outside world. As a woman who came of age in the mid-1920s, Beulah Cousins is representative of what historian Sheldon Taylor called the bridging generation. This cohort of resolute African Canadians built on the foundation of previous generations to overcome limitations of race and class. With a resilient mother for a role model and a father who pushed her to dream and broaden her horizon in Canada and abroad, family positioned Beulah Cousins to overcome gendered limitations that society placed on her. As a young professional, she was a teacher by training, with family connections in US border cities, Cousins' networks, her social networks, gave her entry and access to an exciting world of Black entertainers, business people, athletes, hustlers, you name it. Quote, "We always had some place to go in Detroit, dances, theaters, parties. And this is when we met all the people of our time, our contemporaries. We met anybody who was anybody. We visited the Paradise Valley. Of course, my sister had a lot to do with it. She worked in downtown Detroit and knew all the people downtown, and she was highly respected," end quote. It was quite common for family members, siblings who were born in border cities, Great Lakes cities, to travel quite often to the United States or to reside there, as Cousins, her elder sister, did. In 1928, the same year that Beulah Cousins and her girlfriends began their weekend getaways to Detroit, the city of Windsor erected a plaque at Riverside Drive and Ouellette Avenue, steps from the Detroit River, proclaiming, quote, "Here the slave found freedom," right? And of course, this proclamation is imbued with so much irony and unfulfilled promise of sorts, because Cousins' own weekend getaways to Detroit and going to the Black Bottom, like the hood, the ghetto in Detroit, was to seek freedom, a type of sort of racial solace that Canada lacked. Border crossing in the 1920s and 1930s felt effortless because of the 5-cent ferry rides bridging Windsor and Detroit. When Cousins visited Detroit's Black Bottom during the Depression, her close associates were luminaries such as Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, Earl Hines, Billy Eckstine. Cousins and her African-American husband entertained many of these icons from the United States, including Paul Robeson, Joe Louis, and the notorious Jones Brothers, who literally established a what they called a policy empire, number running what is currently sort of the modern day lottery system in interwar Chicago. Here's the famous heavyweight Joe Louis, a very dear friend of Cousins and her husband. Heavyweight champion Joe Louis wore these boxing gloves on your screen in his title bout against Germany's Max Schmeling at New York City's Yankee Stadium in June 1936. Louis lost that bout. He would avenge sort of the black world in the United States in later bout. But he and his manager, who were very close friends with Beulah and Earl Cousins, and Earl was born in West Virginia. He was African American. They gifted the Cousins this artifact, this historical artifact, which is now on display at the Smithsonian. For African descendants with a cultural heritage and racial consciousness that permeated the Great Lakes region, proximity to friends and family in nearby cities mitigated economic austerity. As the KKK resurged in the 1930s in southwestern Ontario, African Canadians tried to strengthen community institutions. They commemorated, for example, their hard-fought battle for emancipation in the British Empire and the United States. Black people in Great Lakes cities rendezvoused annually at Port Dalhousie, a waterfront community in St. Catharines, Ontario, on the first Thursday in August, the designated weekly rest day for Black domestic workers. According to Danny Braithwaite, and I quote, "That was one of the big events in the community. Everybody got new things. Although it was the Depression, we all managed to scrape some money to get new things, get on the boat, and dance on the boat." And this is one of the leisure boats at Port Dalhousie in St. Catharines. It was like a reunion there, Braithwaite recalled. We all met with our American counterparts at Port Dalhousie. They came from Buffalo and the surrounding areas. Members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the largest Pan-African movement in the history of the Atlantic world, had branches from upstate New York to Detroit to Cleveland, and their members attended the Big Picnic, as it was called, in large numbers. And many of these fairgoers were of Caribbean heritage, which added a very distinct sort of cultural flavor. Braithwaite avowed they would sell mauby, a type of drink from Barbados, sugar cakes and turnovers, things from the West Indies, souse, a stew made with animal byproducts, things like this. We had a great time, end quote. Okay, so I'll be wrapping up here momentarily. On your screen is Alan Malcolm Morrison on the right, on the far right, and his colleagues at the New York office of Ebony, which was a very popular periodical, Black periodical. Morrison began his tenure with Ebony in Chicago in 1946 before moving to their New York office and taking up the editorship in 1948. Alan Malcolm Morrison was born in November 1916 in Toronto to a Jamaican cricketer. His father was a famous cricketer who had arrived in the city at the start of the Great War. Morrison, like other African Canadians of his generation, suffered from an unrecognized birthright. His reverse journey on the famed US-Canadian Freedom Thruway is but one example of many disenchanted Black people who deserted the proverbial promised land for the land of segregation, since it provided opportunities to, quote unquote, advance the race. As a writer interested in Black politics, arts, and letters, Harlem proved an ideal destination for Morrison. With the assistance of two associates in July 1940, he co-founded and published the short-lived Negro World Digest, a periodical modeled after Marcus Garvey's Negro World and Negro Digest, but with a broader scope to showcase the talent of global Black writers. A Marxist and a rising youth leader in Toronto, the Black Mecca provided Morrison a platform to hone his leadership skills in radical politics and showcase his prowess as a budding storyteller. And indeed, he was a gifted storyteller. US entry into the Second World War gave Morrison an unexpected breakthrough. Enlisting in the Army in 1942, he leveraged his journalism experience to climb the ranks. In the theater of war, Morrison used his pen and notepad to fight his two foes, the Nazi war machine and Jim Crow. Black activists used journalism to critique racism and fascism. Morrison had sharpened his advocacy skills as a member of the Canadian Youth Congress. He participated in the Negro Youth Movement, a Pan-African group of young Canadian leaders, such as the Montreal native Juanita de Shield, Grace Price, and Helen Redmond. Members denounced fascism and advocated in behalf of Black communities. Morrison began publishing around 1936 as one of the editors of the short-lived Toronto radical magazine, Advance. After his induction in the US Army, Morrison wrote for Black newspapers at Fort Benning in Georgia and Fort Huachuca, Arizona, before becoming, in 1943, the first Black correspondent for the military daily Stars and Stripes. His fellow journalists considered him one of the most popular writers. Many GIs became familiar with his, quote, meaty, accurate accounts of the war front, although only a handful knew that he was a young, shy, bashful Negro reporter. Some white GIs critiqued his reporting as too celebratory of Black GIs, while some Black GIs thought that he was some liberal white journalist. Nonetheless, his timely pieces on Black troops proved to be a great morale builder for Black soldiers. Sergeant Morrison belonged to a select company. When the Allies invaded occupied France in August 1944, he and 7 Black journalists were embedded with US forces, and they had the front row experience of chronicling this event. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Associated Negro Press, among others, sent correspondence. Morrison highlighted the bravery of Black soldiers, dealing a direct blow to spurious racial theories, quote, showing utter contempt for the master race divisions facing them. US Negro artillerymen firing 155 millimeter howitzers are blasting German installations and troop concentrations and pounding to pieces the Nazi theory of inferior and superior races. Morrison seized any opportunity to politicize overtly and often subtly the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of white supremacy. After the war, Morrison returned to publishing. Working for Ebony in 1946, he climbed the ladder to become the editorial bureau chief of Johnson Publishing Company, the largest Black-owned publisher in the United States. Later that year, on 14th November in New York City, Sergeant Morrison became a naturalized US citizen. His distinguished service in the war effort invariably aided his application for US citizenship. As a Canadian of Jamaican extraction, Morrison's immigration to the United States was tantamount to passing citizenship. Morrison embraced the African-American struggle and experience forged in rural and urban areas, in the North and the South, and in the crucible of war. His decision to change his nationality coincided with his decision to change his legal name from Moyston to Morrison. At the time of his naturalization, he had called himself Morrison for 7 years. Although it is unclear why he chose to use the surname Morrison upon arriving in Harlem in 1939, his easily relatable name Morrison provided him with a new start. Whether passing across borders or passing from one citizenship to another, Pan-Africanists like Morrison displayed remarkable dexterity to adapt, evolve, and resist while subtly subverting the hegemony of Canada, the United States, and the British Empire to control or confine the fate of Black people under a regime of racial caste. Their acute understanding of race relations advanced post-war civil and human rights in the United States and Canada. To obtain full citizenship in the 1930s and 1940s, Black migrants went where opportunity abounded. Borders not only symbolized a threshold in the quest for Black social and economic advancement, but crossing borders was also integral to maintaining familial and other social ties. In many instances, crossing borders was more than a mundane affair. It was an act of solidarity, an act of intimacy, an act of survival. Border crossing provided Black men and women in North America with an exit strategy or a release valve of sorts whenever the pressures of anti-Black racism and disillusionment proved overwhelming. Symphony, thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendell. I'm applauding virtually. I'm not sure if you can see our screens.
Yes.
Other members of the group are too.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll give you a second to take a breath and have a glass of water, and then I'm sure there'll be some questions from the group.
Thank you.
Would you be cool calling on people to speak? It might be easier than having me interpose myself.
Sure, I don't mind.
Yeah. So everybody, you can just raise your hands, and Wendell will call on you with your comment or question.
And if I don't see you, please feel free to speak.
Yeah.
I can start if nobody else wants to start. Thank you for a really fascinating discussion, Wendell. It's a great project, and I can't wait to read more of this stuff. I have a question about the cooperation of the authorities. Just thinking of your last comments and some of the sort of stories that were woven through, and thinking of perhaps sort of people going, crossing the border to escape difficult legal situations, whether criminal or civil. And I was wondering about what the status of, you talked about the border being open, which I think was a really important point, but what kind of collaboration was there between the governments if somebody was trying to slip across a border to avoid sort of legal troubles like that?
Thanks for that question, Dan. Yeah, this is in sort of the early 1900s into interwar period. The border and the U.S.-Canadian border is sort of this weirdly constructed zone that is sometimes regulated and has some oversight. Oftentimes, I mean, this is just sort of vast farm and prairie land, right, where individuals, more or less families, are going back and forth. May Nye does a really good job of looking at sort of the U.S.-Mexico border and sort of the process of surveillance that takes shape as a result of regulating labor and migrants. On the Canadian, on sort of the U.S.-Canadian front, it's not a frontier that is in any way, shape, or form as closely sort of regulated and surveilled. What we do know for a fact is that with respect to Black migrants, in particular Black and African-American homesteaders who at least sought to homestead in the prairies, for example, this inspired a great deal of anxiety among Canadian officials. partly because of sort of a wave of Black scare. And there was always a semblance of Black scare that pervaded Canadian immigration policy. And so there were measures, of course, to administer these really ludicrous medical examinations and sort of an income test, basically to turn Black migrants back to the United States. But one had to do it as quote unquote diplomatically as possible because they were technically US citizens. And so in terms of cooperation, I mean, it's a weird, funny dance that Canada, both the United States and Canada are societies that are predicated on, principally Black racial subordination. In the United States, it's subordination and subjugation. Canadian officials in Ottawa understood that they could certainly manipulate the color line and only allow sort of Black workers in servile roles like sleeping car porters or individuals who were going to work in coal mines. But they had to do it in very subtle ways because African Americans and the African American press would often catch wind of this, right? Because family members would say, hey, we experienced this discriminatory treatment at the border, at a sort of official crossing. Is it true that Canada has a color bar in place? And so the Black press would often speak to these issues. They would write to Canadian immigration officials to see greater clarification. They would publicize these letters in the Black press. And so the type of cooperation that I've discerned was one that is very much sort of the Canadian way to do things very subtly, at least to keep those quote unquote undesirable migrants at bay.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Laura, and hello.
Hi, Wendell. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that talk. And my goodness, it's lovely to be having a Jeudi d'Histoire, even if it's virtual. I'm trying to make it into a question, but I fear it might just be a comment, and then maybe you can run with it, Wendell. But I was really struck with your approach in terms of avoiding the kind of trap of Canada as safe space or the US as unsafe, and really forcing us to think about the very contingent way that people are experiencing these different spaces. And I was struck by your use of biography in order, I think, to really tell that story or make that point. And I wondered if you could just say a bit more about your approach, whether it was discovering people's stories that led you to think about this different way of understanding citizenship, or maybe you were already thinking about citizenship in different ways and then you encountered these stories. But I'd love to hear a bit more about the process behind it. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Initially, when I conceptualized this chapter, I was not thinking so much about these biographical vignettes, but as I delved deeper and deeper into my research and even started looking and reading a lot of oral history, I started to discern sort of these archetypes would emerge, whether individuals who are going north to Canada as part of the Great Migration, which is something that we seldom talk about, that the Great Migration extended into Canada, or individuals who were traveling from Canada to the United States. There were sort of a distinct sort of archetypes of those who were cross-border sort of personalities as a result of military service in the Great War, and because Canada and the United States are, have sort of a very long history of military cooperation and alliance during the Great Wars. Canadians, Americans, those who were coming from the Anglophone Caribbean, again, as British subjects, I mean, they would fight literally on one side or the other side, right? You had brothers, I talk about brothers from the same household, same mother, same father, from Jamaica. One fought in the Jim Crow Army, another the elder brother said, hell no, I'm not fighting a Jim Crow army. You know, I want to fight for the crown. And so enlisted in the one of the Canadian regiments in the Second World War. So there's sort of the military service archetype. There's the archetype of I would say sort of the explorer or the individual who was seeking some form of social escape, a racial solace of sorts. Black women who sort of, as a group, as girlfriends, would travel to Cleveland, to Detroit, etc. There were those who did it mainly for work. In Detroit, interwar Detroit, like the most powerful person, the most powerful Black person was an African Canadian, was a preacher man who literally held the keys to Ford Motor Company. And his word was gospel on the shop floors, right? In terms of getting Black men employment, mediating conflict between Black workers, white workers. And these are individuals clearly who, yes, they might have a distinct sort of African Canadian identity or African American identity. But when you look back in terms of the family tree, there's always sort of a relative who had lived in Canada or lived in the United States or lived in the Caribbean. And so there's this sort of very rich, imbricated identities. And we see these Black actors in many ways, they're in many ways living and upholding this sort of rich tradition of what it means to assert one's identity over a particular landscape, regardless of borders, et cetera. And so long story short, I guess writing in terms of, and including sort of these biographical sketches has allowed me to, I guess, push the boundary of what I initially intended to do, to incorporate more stories. And as you said, to really complicate, interrogate, really sort of deconstruct what the Promised Land meant. And if the Promised Land was so, good and nice, why were individuals who had been Canadian for, let's say, 70 years and had been previously African American the previous 115 years, why were they going back to the land of segregation, right? And sort of this back and forth.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome. Nancy.
Thanks for this. It's so fun to visit you from Alberta and to see colleagues in the East. And I also want to start by saying how much I appreciate this talk as somebody who was raised in Chatham-Kent and who knew this history was there. So, I mean, my question, but wasn't taught it, right? So I'm very excited about your work. I wonder if you could speak about archival sources and then also speak to the erasure of this history and of these rich histories. I mean, we stop at Josiah Henson, like that's all I learned growing up there. But then I know it's been community activism that has preserved, of Black women who have preserved these histories. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the archival sources and the community-based research and also how you're speaking to the erasures of those histories. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, the archival piece, it took a while to stitch some of these stories together. Local sort of historical institutions in Amherstburg, for example, where descendants of enslaved Africans have created a museum and in many ways have preserved their history, has been helpful. Oral history collections, Ontario Black History Society has been helpful. And honestly, sometimes just getting lucky and encountering stories in at like the Reuther Library at Wayne State, and then connecting stories to other archives when I was in Chicago, and then sort of sometimes just retracing the steps of, it might sound a little cliche, but retracing the steps of my actors. One individual in particular, I wanted to share sort of the family experience, but it might have taken a little too long. But he was an African-American publisher, and at the during the Great War, he published and edited the most important Black periodical, at least one of the most important North American, certainly the most important in Canada, called the Canadian Observer. And it was instrumental in helping the Canadian government, federal government, to renounce its color bar of Black soldiers and helping to muster Black troops for the war effort. And this gentleman, J.R. Whitney, was married to an African Canadian woman who was from Windsor, Chatham area. And of course, her ancestors were African Americans. But shortly after the war, archival record is a little hazy on this, but the family went into self-exile and ended up in the Bronx. But their children came up with sort of a dual sort of American, Canadian / British identity and consciousness. And so their son serves in the Second World War as a Tuskegee Airman. He was sort of a lauded fighter pilot. And the family sort of history and connections to Canada was very much sort of ever present in terms of the historical record, right? In terms of bits and pieces that the family has left behind. When I was doing research in Harlem, for example, at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture. And so these experiences I found quite illuminating, because it's really hard to go to Library and Archives Canada and say, hey, I'm looking for call numbers for Black folk who were repeat migrants and serial migrants, right? One literally sort of, you have to cast a dragnet and just see what you can reel in. And so I sort of had a Great Lakes strategy when I was doing research a few years ago, and just sort of was hopping around from Chicago to Detroit, Cleveland, Windsor, etc., and just trying to follow the footsteps and trying to gather whatever I could from newspaper sources, local historical institutions, etc. And sometimes actually I was able to connect with some family members who were able to shed more light on their family's experiences living on either side of the border. Yes, Sean, and hello.
Hi, great to see you. Thank you so much for this, really, really rich talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role that you see for culture in creating this cross-border cosmopolitanism of musicians going back and forth. I know, people like Robeson were playing often in Toronto throughout the 1930s. Whole kind of world of musicians going back and forth. So yeah, if you could speak a little bit to that, that'd be fascinating to hear.
Sure. Culture is paramount in this period in the 30s and the 40s. Certainly, I think most people here are familiar with sort of the age of jazz, right? In this city in particular, Montreal, and sort of the attraction, the magnetism of African American culture, of African American musicians, artists, etc. But culture is one of those, I would say, salient social assets that helps bridge the border. And so with somebody like Beulah Cousins, her entire sort of world, her cosmopolitan cross-border world was predicated around artists, musicians, writers, individuals who, tangentially were connected to the Harlem Renaissance, but they were more or less based sort of in the Detroit, Windsor corridor. And because of these connections, whenever guys like Robeson and Joe Louis, sports being a different type of culture, but a culture nonetheless, whenever they came to Canada, you had Black folk in Windsor and Chatham and Toronto that acted as cultural ambassadors, more or less, right? And whenever some of these individuals like Earl Hines, let's say, he was scheduled to perform at like the Palais Royal in Toronto, and let's say the Palais Royal drew the color line and wouldn't admit other Black revelers and other Black attendees. There were these sort of cultural ambassadors in place who would speak with the white sort of power establishments, right? In terms of brokering solutions. And so I'm quite intrigued in terms of how this relationship was very much bidirectional. It wasn't in any way one-sided, but Black culture sort of writ large was a bridging mechanism, as I had alluded to earlier. I'm like scanning the cells of my computer, and yeah. Yes, Daniel.
Oh, maybe I'll let Geneviève, my colleague Geneviève, go first.
Hi, Geneviève.
Hello. Hello, thank you so much. I'm fascinated by your methodology that underpin your just the whole historical narrative that you just gave us. And I want to return a bit to some of the questions that some of the other participants had about this. It just seems to me that part of how rich your project was the strategies that you had to develop as a researcher to go against the way that against archival collections, right? I just can't imagine how you were like you had to go against do you understand a bit French?
Minimally.
It's okay if there is no problem. Okay, I'll continue it. There's no problem. It's just that like all intuitions of your research go against the way in which archival collections were organized, right? I really appreciated the comments that you had about the limitations of the census that prevent you from going after some of the questions you want to understand, the way in which different categories of archival collection will be run differently in Canada and in US, because archivists based in Canada and US think about the questions and about Blackness in different ways, right? So here are my questions. They seem naive, but I love thinking of the methodology underneath these transnational perspectives. So the questions for me is, what was first, I want to congratulate you, and I can't wait to read that book, like see the depth of that methodology and those strategies you had to develop. And so the question is, what was your biggest surprise as you did the research for that project? And if you were also able to share with us the biggest challenge you had to face while doing this research, I'd be really curious to know and to learn from your impressions on this.
Biggest surprise and biggest challenge. Okay, thanks, Geneviève. Let me start with the challenge first. I guess, yeah, this was actually a very real concern and challenge for me. How to integrate these biographies in a way that didn't seem disjointed to a reader. And so one of the ways that I tried to mitigate against that was to organize these sort of biographical vignettes along thematic lines, but not simply thematic, but also sort of chronological. Sometimes, some of my actors they're literally like, there's like a 6 degrees of separation, right? And so I try to use chronology, I try to use geography, I try to use sort of various thematic points to stitch the narrative together. Yeah, so I think that was probably like the main challenge because a chapter like this can easily seem sort of choppy. And so I have no way, mastered this, but I'm certainly working on it and trying to make it as refined as possible. And it always helps when you have actors, when, one family member says that they will, cast their bucket down in Canada and make life work here. And another says, no, 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 we're going to the States. And so you have these sort of familial divisions. And then, both eventually are like, heck, I'm disillusioned as hell. Let me go across the Atlantic and see if the soil might be greener there. And so, I mean, this is quintessentially the life of diasporic Africans in this hemisphere. In terms of surprises, I'm quite intrigued that, some of the individuals that I write about, I mean, they were literally making history, not in like a sort of a banal way. They were literally like groundbreaking historical figures that we just have not talked about. We have not explored their experiences because, sometimes national histories have a way of just cordoning off just the nation state, right? But once we sort of cast the nation state and under new lens, whether it's a borderlands angle, it's a transnational, a diasporic, hemispheric angle, all of a sudden you see individuals who are doing things who are literally like pioneers at it, right? And I guess the other surprise was how individuals whom initially I thought as like, an ordinary woman, an ordinary man, turns out to have this wickedly rich like social network, to the point where like, I mean, today, like what would constitute their archive is, you'll find it at like the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C., or the Smithsonian. And I'm thinking, these are just regular Canadian folk, regular Canadian peoples, right, who had amassed this sort of rich life experience and sort of archival and historical material by virtue of the conversations they were having in the 30s and 40s, by virtue of their friends, by virtue of where they had pursued work, and that they were at the cutting edge of conversations, debates, struggles that would crescendo in the 60s and 70s. And so that has been really, really humbling. I thought I always knew this on a sort of intuitive level, that ordinary people, regular folk, really do have like such significant impact on history. But this has been really humbling to see that.
Yeah, that's it. It's very inspiring. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Daniel, should I come back to you?
Yeah, I talked enough. Maybe I noticed Magda Farney has her hand up.
Okay. Oh, there she is. Yes. Hi.
Sure.
Magda.
Hi. Thank you very much. That was such a rich talk. I have a really nerdy historian question, and I haven't asked it before now because it's so nerdy, but I will follow up on Nancy and Genevieve's questions about sources. I know that my colleagues who work on Franco-American migration, cross-border migration, often use the Soundex index to border entries, to Canadian border entries or US border entries. And I've always been curious about these sources, and I've never used them myself, and I don't know what kind of information they hold or they contain. But I wondered, is that a source that's been useful for you at all? Has that allowed you to sort of track back and forth movements across the border? I don't know if they're complete sources or if they're as porous as the border itself was, but I would like to hear you on that because it's a source I've always wanted to use myself.
Thank you for that, Magda. So my foray into that was actually came through looking at U.S. Census data based on this particular on these data sets. But in some instances, I've been able to track and map out individual border movements and migrations. But I wanted to gain a big picture understanding as well. And so the larger census data sets had been most useful. So I'm in no way, shape, or form an expert. Yeah. Yes, Daniel and Sonia.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, I'll finally ask my question. Thanks, Wendell. I wonder if you can help us fit this story you've presented today into a larger trajectory of Afro-descendant migrations in North America. Like, I noticed that your book project goes until 1992. Do people continue to move back and forth across the border, searching for some sort of rootedness or belonging? Are they fixed in place by changing immigration rules? What happens particularly after the period you're discussing?
Sure. So after the period I'm discussing, so in the 50s, 60s, the 70s. So the next sort of seismic shift in terms of cross-border movement was ushered in by the Vietnam War and the Black Power movement and civil rights struggle. And so not only are we seeing Black radicals, Panthers, various Black Power affiliates, Black draft resistors, but we're also seeing white draft resistors in the 60s and the 70s who are very much literally invoking the language of Black liberation, of the Underground Railroad, and various Black liberation icons. Going back even before my project starts in 1919, to, I would say, 18th century, 1780s, so post US Revolutionary War, and the Ordinance of 1787, for example, in the United States outlaws slavery as an institution from like the Northwest Territories, right? What is present day the Ohio River Valley. At that time, it has a very profound geopolitical impact that we seldom appreciate because slavery in Upper Canada, Black folk who were in Upper Canada, enslaved Black folk, whether they were under British or Indigenous jurisdiction, fled south. So this is probably like the first iteration of an actual Underground Railroad. Fled south into the Ohio River Valley because slavery had been outlawed there, right? And so in subsequent decades, and certainly with the US Revolution, with the War of 1812, there's meaningful movement across the border of Black folk, of people of African descent. In the antebellum period, of course, because of the Enslaved Fugitive Act of 1815 in particular, there's greater movement. But with the emergence of the US Civil War, there's, again, a significant return migration of a lot of African Americans from Southwestern Ontario. Because of Reconstruction and anti-Black racial terrorism, some families moved back north into Southwestern Ontario and other points beyond. And so for African descendants, migration literally is self-determination, right? To move with your feet is to exercise your right as a free agent, or at least aspire to free agency. But certainly this cross-border movement is a theme that is evident in subsequent chapters, but the 30s and the 40s is one where I really look at sort of these micro biographies of people going back and forth.
Thanks very much.
Welcome.
Well,
Sonia?
thank you very much for that very inspiring talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the 1930s, because of the economic crisis, even though the Canadian-American border was not that as controlled or surveilled as the Mexican border, I was wondering if the border crossing was more difficult, or if the Black community kind of, how they adapted, and if they developed like different strategies to be able to cross borders and maybe look for work. So there's, because of that period, during that time, there's that, even in Canada and in the States, they're trying to hire only nationals. So I was wondering how it played for people crossing borders on a regular basis.
Yeah, excellent question. The 30s is, oh my goodness, such a fascinating period. In fact, Beulah Cousins, for example, talks about the difficulty of finding work. And this is somebody who's biracial. She's half white, half Black, right? And that's for Black women who wanted to do any clerical work or, work as teachers, more or less white collar jobs. One had to be of a particular hue. One had to be of, light complexion. And she talks about, her strong affinity and identity as a British subject, as Canadian. But that notwithstanding, during the Depression, she, I would say, sort of absconded to the United States, right? Because she had a network there. And even though things were really grimy and rugged, she could make ends meet, right? There's several cases of individuals who actually had been very adamant. And incidentally, weirdly enough, they were African-American by birth, like ethnically African-American, who had moved or immigrated to Canada in like the 1910s. And they were very adamant that we need to cast our buckets down in the Dominion, right? And more or less maybe create like a beachhead. And this is very reminiscent of Marion Shaw Carey, who's a Black abolitionist publisher. These individuals were very adamant that they should try to make the most of their circumstances in the Dominion and to establish a beachhead, and that the sort of brain drain to the United States, right? The Black migration to the United States was actually hurting the possibility of a Black future in Canada. But with the arrival of the Depression, because again, economically things were just so dire, especially for Black folk, many of these individuals actually crossed the border and went to the United States. Again, paradoxically, regardless of how racist it was, regardless of the lynchings, the sheer racial terror, the racial subordination, Blackfoot could eke out a semblance of an existence or subsistence, pardon me, in the United States. And so individuals continued to cross the border and to go to the US.
Thank you.
Don?
Sure. Hi, Wendell. I'm just to sort of, I guess, build on, and thank you for the talk. That was an excellent talk. Very, just to echo what everyone else has said. I'm wondering if so just to build on what Daniel was talking about in terms of like how things change over time. And I'm thinking about just like the meaning of crossing the border. Like, does sojourning change into having to make a decision like do you find that in the life stories that you've been able to sort of explore, whether that changes in the 20th century?
The idea of sojourning, whether that changes?
Yeah, or whether there is a need to commit to a country. Does that perception change over the course of the 20th century?
Yeah. Very good. This is really hard to answer. Yeah, it's really hard to answer, and I guess I'll try to respond this way. So after World War II, with the rise of the freedom struggle in the United States, and then sort of the rise of Black militancy and Black power in the Vietnam War, there was this sense of urgency that the United States, and of course, pardon me, one of the chapters, a couple of my chapters looks at sort of the effects of COINTELPRO in a sort of transnational, international, cross-border sense. But the effects of this counterintelligence program, and of course the Vietnam War, et cetera, that the United States had lost all or any moral authority or legitimacy that it ever had. The little that it had actually just lost it, right? And with the assassinations of various Black leaders, Messianic Negroes, as J. Edgar Hoover referred to them, that it was all lost, right? And that the most effective thing was leave and create a beachhead. And from a beachhead, one could resist US racial tyranny. And this is where, you know, it's really frustrating. History, of course, can be very frustrating. There are no sort of romantic endings. But the frustration is that invariably with all these individuals, men and women who arrive in Canada at the outset, you know, Canadian society is much more tolerable, right? It's less militaristic, it's less violent, etc. But over the passage of time, once sort of the gears of the Canadian nation state sort of grind these individuals in terms of their racial subordination, right, and reminding them of the limits of their permanent residency, or for those who naturalize, the limits of their citizenship. Immediately, the United States is no longer sort of this irredeemable place, right? And these are individuals, these are Panthers who have been, you know, charged on trumped up accusations of, you know, shooting police officers or other sort of egregious charges. These are individuals who were other Black Power militants. These are individuals who had lost comrades to counterintelligence, the counterintelligence program in the 60s and 70s. But upon spending, you know, several months, a year, 2 years in Canadian society, they realized that even though the United States, yes, it is unequivocally the belly of the beast, it was a beast that they knew, right? It was a beast around which they could navigate. And then Canadian society, the rules were a little different. Not only were the rules different, but no one ever tells you that this is your place as a Black person, right? This is off limits as a Black person. And so as a result of that, the level of disillusionment, you know, spikes very quickly. And in turn, you know, some of these African-American expats would invoke seeking a new promised land. And that promised land would be Africa, right? And sometimes it's often rhetorical because geographically there's a huge sort of right, separation between the Americas and Africa, but it speaks to this sort of perennial yearning for Black freedom fighters, for Black activists, that a promised land has always eluded them, right? That there's no place where one could actually find racial dignity. And even if that means returning to the United States and fighting, right? And sort of casting one's bucket down. And so I guess in a sort of a roundabout way, Don, yeah, these dynamics of sort of racial disillusionment, of opportunities denied, of sort of state oppression, of, you know, the RCMP, which was the right, or to quote Black Panther activists, the RCMP was a lackey of the FBI, the left hand of the US war machine. Canada was the left hand of the US war machine. You know, this place was like a surveillance zone in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And so we see, you know, some individuals returning to the Caribbean, those who especially were of Caribbean descent. But that doesn't stop the story. The story certainly doesn't end there, right? There are many things that are happening in terms of whether it's like CIA intrigue and all sorts of tomfoolery. I was going to use a much stronger word, but then I realized my son is too young to hear daddy swearing, so I'm not going to swear.
Are there further questions for Wendell? Anyone who'd like to continue the conversation a bit? I have lots, but I'm also conscious that everyone has just finished a workday, and our speaker included. Okay, well, Wendell, I'd like to thank you deeply on behalf of the Montreal History Group and everyone who's here. It was fascinating to hear about your research, and I hope it's just the first time that you come and share your work with us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you all for your receptiveness, your kindness. Much appreciated.
All right.
And your thoughtful